When the engine died and the car rolled to a stop on a narrow road in the middle of nowhere, I told myself it was just an inconvenience, nothing more. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky in long strokes of gold and crimson, but all I could think about was how silent it had suddenly become. No traffic, no signal, no escape. I looked at him, my husband's son from a previous marriage, sitting next to me, tapping at his phone with that calm, collected look he always wore. There was something unsettling about the stillness, the way the air sat heavy between us. I reached for my own phone, hoping for reception, but the screen stayed blank. No bars. No map. No way out. That's when he turned to me and said, "It's getting dark. We should find a place to stay." Just that, like it was the most natural thing in the world. But my heart skipped. Not because I was scared. Not because I didn't trust him. But because deep down, a part of me had been waiting for something to break the routine. Something to jolt me out of the numbness. Something dangerous. I didn't answer right away. I stared at the trees lining the road like they might offer a solution. But they didn't. They just stood there, silent witnesses. I felt my hands go cold. My voice caught in my throat. And even though I hadn't done anything wrong, not yet, I knew I had just crossed an invisible line. 3 hours earlier, I was a wife on a trip. Now, I was a woman stranded with someone she shouldn't be thinking about the way I was. And I know how that sounds. But let me explain. Let me tell you how it all started, long before the car broke down. Before the restaurant. Before the photo. Before he looked at me in a way no one had looked at me in years. And before my entire life came undone by a choice I didn't mean to make. But first, tell me in the comments, have you ever been stuck somewhere with someone you shouldn't be alone with? Did you make it out unchanged? We were barely 30 minutes into the drive when I first noticed it, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. Calm, steady, like he had nothing to prove. He didn't fidget. Didn't overtalk. He drove with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that unnerved me more than anything. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the way the heat of the afternoon clung to my skin, how the fabric of my dress had started to stick to the curve of my back. He wasn't my son. I reminded myself of that every time I caught myself glancing at him for longer than necessary. He was my husband's child, yes, but from another life, one I hadn't been part of. Still, the label clung. Stepson. It sounded wrong, even in my head. Too technical. Too removed. Too safe. My husband had asked me to go with him, said he couldn't make the trip, that someone had to drop off the documents at the law firm across the state. I'd said yes without thinking, partly out of obligation, partly out of the usual need to be agreeable. That's how I'd always survived marriage, by being agreeable. Helpful. Pleasant. Expected. But somewhere between the first hour of silence and the moment the engine sputtered and died, I stopped feeling like myself. At first, we thought it was just a hiccup. A warning light. Maybe something with the battery. But after 3 attempts and the same stalling sound, he leaned back in his seat and sighed. It's not starting. I reached for my phone. No signal. Try yours, I said, already knowing the answer. He shook his head. Dead zone, I think. Nothing here. We sat there for a while, not speaking. Just listening to the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant rustle of wind through trees. He looked around, then nodded toward the horizon. There's a town on the map. 20 minutes walking, maybe. Could have a motel. I hesitated. It wasn't late yet, but the sun was definitely starting its descent. The idea of walking along an unfamiliar road with him, just the two of us, made something twist in my stomach. Still, I didn't protest. We locked the car and started walking. The road was cracked, lined with weeds and wildflowers. I kept my eyes forward, but I was aware of every step he took beside me. Every breath. Every brush of his sleeve against mine. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was heavy. Like we were both aware of something unspoken sitting between us, waiting. The town, when it appeared, looked like a place time forgot. One gas station. A general store with flickering neon. A motel with a faded sign and paint peeling from the wood. "There's a room available," he said, returning from the front desk. "2 beds." I nodded. "Fine." The room was small, clean, too quiet. I opened the window just to hear something, traffic, birds, anything. But all I got was more silence and the scent of pine. He set our bags down. I unpacked nothing. "We should get dinner," he said eventually. "There's a place across the street." I agreed. Anything to break the tension. The diner was almost empty. Red booths, dusty blinds, a waitress who looked like she didn't want to be there. We ordered coffee and sandwiches. Talked about the car. The documents. The weather. But underneath it all, I felt the shift, like the fabric of our roles had begun to tear. He asked me if I missed the city. I said sometimes. He asked if I was happy. I paused too long before answering. Back in the room, I changed in the bathroom, careful to keep the door locked. I stared at myself in the mirror. I looked older. Tired. Not unattractive, but not the woman I used to be. I adjusted the collar of my blouse. Wiped off some mascara. When I came out, he was sitting on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. He looked up. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. But the air was thick with things I couldn't say. That night, I lay awake longer than I should have. I could hear him breathing. The occasional shift of fabric as he turned in bed. I wondered if he was awake too. Wondered if he was thinking the same things I was trying not to think. This wasn't supposed to be anything but a short trip. A favor. A weekend errand. But something had shifted the moment that car stopped. Or maybe it had shifted long before, and I just hadn't noticed. Either way, I knew that after tonight, nothing would feel quite the same again. The morning light crept in through the dusty motel curtains, casting long beams across the patterned carpet and the edge of my bed. I had slept, but it hadn't felt like rest. My mind had wandered all night, caught between guilt and curiosity, between the warmth of memory and the chill of restraint. I turned my head slowly and saw him, still asleep on the other bed, one arm slung above his head, the blanket fallen halfway down his chest. He looked peaceful. Unburdened. As if nothing had shifted, as if nothing had stirred between us. I envied that quiet. I got up and dressed silently, not bothering with makeup. Something about this place made appearances feel unimportant. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, the pavement still holding the night's coolness. I walked toward the diner, expecting to sit alone with a cup of coffee and my thoughts. But he followed not long after, shoes crunching on the gravel behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. We sat across from each other again, just like the night before, but the atmosphere had changed. He didn't speak right away, and neither did I. The waitress came by, poured our coffee, and disappeared without a word. I stared at the rising steam and tried to focus on its rhythm, the way it curled upward before fading into nothing. Then he said it. "You seem quiet today." I nodded, not trusting my voice. There was a lump in my throat that wouldn't go away, no matter how many times I swallowed. I could still feel the weight of his gaze on me from the night before. I could still feel the echo of my own questions. He didn't press me. That was one thing I always noticed about him, he never pushed. He offered space, a kind of respectful patience that made me feel safe and exposed at the same time. I wanted to thank him and blame him all at once. After breakfast, we walked. Not far, just a few streets down from the motel. The town looked different in daylight. Sleepy, quieter than I'd realized. A few locals passed us on the sidewalk, nodding politely, but my mind was far away. My body moved, but my thoughts were stuck on the curve of last night, the charged silence, the awareness that something had started, whether I liked it or not. There was a small park at the end of the street. A wooden bench under a tree, sunlit patches scattered across the grass. He suggested we rest there for a moment before checking on the car. I agreed. We sat in silence again, but it wasn't awkward. If anything, it was the only place that felt honest. He leaned back, looked up at the tree above us, and said, "I used to come to places like this when I needed to think." I looked at him then, finally really looked at him. "What do you need to think about?" He didn't answer immediately. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if he was editing himself in real time. Eventually, he shrugged. Things. That one word said everything and nothing. And somehow, it mirrored my own answer. I stood up first, brushing imaginary dust from my skirt. "Let's go see if they've looked at the car yet." We headed back, walking slower than before. The sun was higher now, but the breeze kept it pleasant. Along the way, he reached out, not in a bold way, just lightly touched my arm when a cyclist sped past us. It was instinctive, protective. But it lingered. Not long. A second. Maybe two. Still, it was enough. Back at the auto shop, the mechanic explained it would take another few hours. Something about a part needing replacement. I only half listened, nodding at the right moments, feeling the minutes stretch long and uncertain. We had time to fill, and nothing but each other to fill it with. He suggested we take a short drive to a nearby lake the motel manager had mentioned. We borrowed an old rental from the shop, something rusted but functional, and headed out. The drive was quiet. More hills than I expected, more silence than I could handle. I turned on the radio to break it, but the signal was weak, filled with static and half-songs. The lake was small, more of a wide pond, really. Still, it was beautifully calm and surrounded by trees that swayed gently in the breeze. There was a bench at the edge, partially shaded. We sat again, and again, the silence grew heavy. This time, I broke it. "You asked if I was happy," I said, voice low, eyes on the water. I didn't know how to answer. He didn't respond right away. But when he did, it was simple. "You don't have to." But I did. I needed to. "I'm not unhappy," I said. "That's the hard part. I have what people would call a good life. A steady one. Predictable. Safe. But I think somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like I was in it." The words surprised even me, but once they were out, I couldn't pull them back. He didn't say anything, just sat with them, let them land. We stayed at the lake longer than we should have. The sun climbed higher, birds came and went, and somewhere in all that stillness, I realized how far I'd drifted from who I used to be. Not just as a wife, but as a woman. As someone who once felt things deeply, openly. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me and really seen me. Back in the car, we didn't talk. Not even during the drive back to town. But the silence no longer felt awkward, it felt charged. Everything between us hummed with things we hadn't said. I kept my hands folded in my lap, staring out the window, watching the trees blur past. At the motel, the mechanic was waiting. The car was ready. We packed our things in silence. As we loaded the bags, I felt a shift, something final about leaving that room behind. It had only been a single night, but it felt like it held a version of me I hadn't met in years. Before getting into the car, I looked at him. He looked back. Neither of us said anything. But we both knew. And later, at the next town, in the shaded garden behind a small cafe where no one was watching, we kissed. We kissed. The road stretched out before us in quiet, endless lines. We had been driving for over an hour since leaving the lake, and still, the silence sat between us, dense and complex. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt almost necessary, as if words might break something delicate that neither of us was prepared to face. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting amber streaks across the dashboard and catching the stray threads of my hair, making them glint like wire. I watched the trees blur past my window, the rural landscape flattening into long fields and brief glimpses of distant homes. Every so often, he'd glance at the GPS, check the route, adjust the volume of the low, instrumental music playing through the speakers. He looked focused. Calm. But I noticed his jaw tighten every time we passed another car, or when I shifted in my seat. We were both aware of what had happened, even if no one had said anything about it since. There was no need to say it. The kiss had already rewritten the space between us. It had taken something unspoken and made it real and irreversible. We stopped in a small town just before sunset, one of those quiet places built around a central square with a few shops, a gas station, and a modest inn that doubled as a cafe. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few locals closing up for the evening. The motel we found had a faded green sign and a porch that creaked under our steps. It wasn't luxurious, but we didn't need luxury. We needed a place to rest, to breathe, to pretend for a little while longer that we were just two people on a road trip. Inside, the room was simple. 2 beds. Thin curtains. A television that buzzed faintly even when turned off. He took one bed, and I took the other. Our suitcases remained closed. We moved carefully, like people trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. I sat on the edge of the mattress, toes pressing into the scratchy carpet, and let my shoulders sag forward. My head was heavy. My chest even more so. I kept replaying the way he had looked at me just before the kiss, not with expectation or need, but something gentler. Something I hadn't seen in years. There had been no grand gesture, no sweeping music, no lingering dramatic pause. Just a simple moment in a shaded garden. Just him, looking at me like I mattered. And then, we kissed. I rubbed my forehead and exhaled slowly. The air in the room felt too still. He offered to get food from the cafe downstairs, and I nodded without looking up. After he left, I went to the small bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I stared into the mirror longer than I intended. I didn't look different. I still looked like me, maybe a little tired, maybe a little older than I remembered from just a week ago. But something had shifted inside, something I couldn't name yet. When he returned with food in paper bags, we ate without much talk. A few remarks about the town, the weather, the route tomorrow. Safe topics. I watched the way he held his fork, the way he chewed thoughtfully, and I wondered if he was as lost in his head as I was in mine. After we finished, he set his trash aside and sat quietly, fingers laced in his lap. I could feel his glance, but I didn't meet it. I wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. There were too many questions, and I didn't trust the answers that might follow. We turned in early. I lay on top of the covers, still fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the old air conditioner filled the space like white noise, but it couldn't drown out the pulse in my ears. I closed my eyes and tried to will myself to sleep, but my thoughts wouldn't slow. It wasn't just the kiss that had shaken me. It was what it represented. The fact that it had felt so natural, so inevitable. I should have felt guilt, maybe even fear. But mostly, I felt clarity. A strange, steady understanding that what had happened was no accident. It had been coming for a long time, not just between him and me, but within me. Somewhere between routine and responsibility, I had begun to disappear. And now, part of me had reawakened. I didn't know if that was right or wrong. I only knew it was real. He didn't speak again until morning. We both woke early, even before the sunlight crept fully through the curtains. He was already sitting up, checking something on his phone, his hair slightly mussed from sleep. I turned my head slowly, feeling the stiffness in my neck and shoulders. "We should get going early," he said. His voice was quiet. Measured. I nodded. Probably best. We didn't linger. We packed in silence, moved around each other with unspoken understanding. He offered me the last of the coffee he bought the night before, and I accepted it with a small nod. It was lukewarm, bitter, but I drank it anyway. As we checked out, the woman at the front desk smiled warmly and asked if we'd enjoyed our stay. I answered politely, almost mechanically. He thanked her. We stepped out into the morning light, and it was as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Back in the car, the drive felt longer than it should have. The landscape rolled by, and the world kept moving, unaware of the shift that had occurred. But in the quiet of the cabin, I sat with a new version of myself, one that was still uncertain, still full of questions, but no longer asleep. I didn't know where this road would take us. I didn't know what would happen when we got back. But I knew I couldn't pretend anymore, not about the kiss, not about the silence, not about the parts of me that had finally woken up. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to see where that truth would lead. The morning sun rose behind us as we drove, its light bleeding softly through the rearview mirror, casting golden lines across the dashboard. We were headed home, or at least in the direction of it, but everything about the drive felt uncertain. He kept his eyes on the road, both hands on the wheel, occasionally glancing at signs, adjusting the GPS, or sipping from the coffee we'd picked up before leaving town. I sat quietly, watching the landscape roll past in waves of green and beige, fields stretching as far as the horizon allowed. I didn't know what to say, and perhaps that was for the best. We'd both said enough without using words. The silence wasn't cold, nor was it warm, it simply existed, like a third passenger in the car, heavy and attentive. Every time his fingers adjusted the air vent or changed lanes, I felt it, a pulse of awareness. It wasn't about anticipation anymore. The shift had already happened. We stopped once for gas in a small roadside station with rusted signage and an old vending machine humming by the wall. I waited in the car while he went inside to pay. I watched him through the windshield, hands in pockets, nodding to the cashier. From a distance, he looked older, more distant, as if the closeness from the past 2 days had suddenly peeled away, leaving just space and silence between us. When he returned, he handed me a bottle of water without a word and got back into the driver's seat. I took it, murmured thanks, and turned my eyes back to the road. The town where we were supposed to stop for lunch was still an hour away. It was then, as the road curved gently and opened up to a stretch of quiet farmland, that I saw it. A car. Parked near the edge of a small gravel turnout. Nondescript, dark gray, windows up. But it wasn't the vehicle itself that made something tighten in my chest, it was the shape of the man standing beside it. Leaning back casually against the hood, arms crossed. Sunglasses. Jeans. Tan coat. His stance was relaxed, but the stillness of his posture, the way his head turned just slightly as we passed, made my stomach clench. It was him. I didn't say anything. I wasn't even sure I trusted my own eyes. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But the chill that ran through my chest didn't come from nowhere. He didn't look at me, at least not directly, but I felt seen. As we drove past, I kept my head turned slightly toward the passenger window, breathing evenly, trying not to let it show. My hands trembled slightly on my lap, hidden beneath the seatbelt strap. I didn't want him, my stepson, to see me react. I didn't want to explain something I couldn't even define. About 10 minutes later, I broke the silence. "There was someone back there," I said, keeping my tone flat. "At the turnout." He nodded. "Yeah. I saw." "Did he look familiar to you?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "No." I turned to look at him then, but he kept his gaze on the road, jaw tight. His fingers tapped once against the steering wheel before he stopped himself. We didn't speak again for the rest of the drive into town. The cafe we stopped at was quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a pharmacy. It had outdoor seating shaded by a wooden pergola overgrown with vines. The waitress was kind, the menu handwritten, and the food simple. But I could barely taste anything. My thoughts kept spiraling back to the man by the car. To the possibility that someone had been watching us. Or worse, that someone knew. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A coincidence. A stranger. A momentary trick of sunlight and shape. But I'd been looked at before. I knew what it felt like when someone watched too closely. After the meal, we walked along the small main street. The town was quaint, almost picturesque. But it felt hollow beneath the surface. Every shadow, every passerby, seemed laced with suspicion, even if I knew that was irrational. Still, the unease clung to me like humidity. At a small antique shop, we ducked inside to browse. I pretended to study porcelain teacups, vintage postcards, and brass trinkets. But I could feel his eyes on me across the room. Not in the way they had been before. Not tender or curious, but cautious. Measured. And then, quietly, he came closer. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "I'm just tired." He didn't press. Back in the car, I tried to rest my eyes, to escape for just a moment into the stillness of a false nap. But my mind wouldn't let go. My thoughts were racing, retracing every step of the past few days, every look, every breath, every unsaid sentence. That evening, we checked into another motel, this one a bit more modern, with automated check-in and clean white linens. 2 separate beds again. 2 lamps. A small television bolted to the wall. It should have felt routine by now. But it didn't. After we settled in, he went to shower, and I sat on the bed with my back against the headboard, the glow of my phone screen the only light in the room. No new messages. Nothing from my husband. Nothing from anyone. For the first time, I wanted someone to ask where I was. To demand an answer. To give me a reason to define what I was doing and why. But silence met me at every turn. He returned from the bathroom with damp hair, a towel around his neck, and a distant look on his face. We didn't talk. I didn't ask what he was thinking. We just sat in separate spaces, separated by a line we both had already crossed and didn't know how to uncross. Later, when the lights were off and the room was dark except for the faint glow of a street lamp outside, I turned to face the wall. My eyes wide open. Breathing steady. I listened to the stillness, to the quiet rhythm of the air conditioning, to the knowledge that someone, maybe no one, maybe everyone, had seen us. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that the consequences were already in motion. Whether we wanted them or not. Whether we understood them or not. Tomorrow, we would keep moving. We had to. But nothing was the same. Not anymore. The morning crept in slowly, gray and quiet. I had drifted in and out of sleep all night, never fully resting, never fully alert. My body had remained still, but my mind had traveled in circles, over conversations that hadn't happened, over looks that had lasted too long, and most of all, over the figure standing by the roadside the day before. That image had etched itself behind my eyes, and no matter how many times I told myself it meant nothing, I couldn't believe it. When I finally sat up, the other bed was empty. He had already dressed and gone out, or maybe just needed space. I didn't blame him. I felt like I needed to step out of myself, if only for a minute, to think without the pressure of my own thoughts closing in. I got ready slowly. Everything about the room felt foreign, yet repetitive, just another copy of the place before. Beige walls, dated art, 2 white towels folded neatly like an apology. As I splashed water on my face and stared into the mirror, I realized how much older I looked today than I had just a week ago. Not from age, but from the weight of everything I was carrying. The sleepless nights, the emotional knots, the fear of what I'd let happen, and what still might happen. Downstairs, I found him sitting on a bench outside the motel entrance, a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. He looked up as I approached, his eyes neutral but alert. I sat beside him without saying anything. We watched the cars pass on the highway in front of us, the occasional truck shaking the ground slightly as it sped by. After a few quiet minutes, he broke the silence. I figured we'd head out in an hour. That okay? I nodded. Yeah. That's fine. We didn't talk again. We didn't need to. The silence between us had become something more than emptiness, it was a boundary, a way to contain everything we didn't dare put into words. But underneath it, something was shifting. I could feel it. Like the pause before a decision. Like the second before a door is either opened or left shut forever. We got back on the road just after 8. The weather had changed, clouds had moved in, thick and low, muting the sky and casting a dull hue over the world around us. I watched the lines on the pavement disappear beneath the car, one after another, hypnotic in their rhythm. Every few miles, he adjusted the air conditioning or checked the route, but mostly, we drove in silence. It wasn't until we reached a small town near the state border that we stopped again. He pulled into a parking lot beside a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s, faded signage, a payphone mounted on the wall outside, and a single newspaper machine with rust at the corners. He glanced at me before turning off the engine. Breakfast? I nodded, and we stepped inside. The place was nearly empty, except for an older couple in the corner booth and a young waitress behind the counter. She greeted us with a tired smile and gestured toward a booth by the window. We sat, menus already placed on the table, and ordered something simple. Coffee, eggs, toast. Safe choices. As we waited, I found myself watching the people around us. The couple in the corner barely spoke, eating in synchronized silence, their eyes rarely meeting. I wondered how long they'd been married. Whether they still noticed each other or simply moved through life out of habit. The thought made my throat tighten. The food arrived quickly, and we ate slowly, more out of politeness than hunger. He picked at his eggs, sipping coffee between bites. I tried to focus on my plate, but my mind wandered. Then, as I lifted my cup, I saw him glance out the window, and freeze. My stomach dropped. I followed his gaze, expecting the worst. But all I saw was a car pulling into the gas station across the street. Just another traveler. Nothing unusual. Still, his reaction lingered in the air. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. After we paid and returned to the car, I hesitated before opening the door. There's something we're not saying, I said, keeping my voice low. He looked at me, eyes calm but serious. I know. And we're going to keep not saying it? His hand rested on the top of the car door. Do you want to say it? I looked down. No. He nodded once, then opened his door and got in. I followed. The road ahead was quiet. For a long time, we didn't speak. Not until we passed a small clearing on the side of the highway, where a row of trees gave way to a wide, open field. Without a word, he pulled over. I need to walk, he said, already stepping out. I followed, unsure why. We walked along the edge of the field, the grass brushing against our legs, the breeze carrying a faint scent of rain. After a few minutes, he stopped and turned toward me. I didn't plan for this, he said. I met his eyes. Neither did I. He didn't reach for me. Didn't move closer. Just stood there, hands in his pockets, letting the words fall between us. I don't know what happens now, I admitted. Maybe nothing happens, he said. Maybe we just keep going. Or maybe we stop. I exhaled slowly, the wind catching my breath. And if we stop, does it go away? I don't think it works like that. I looked down at the grass. At my shoes. At the place where our shadows touched. Then, after a long moment, I stepped forward. Just enough. Just once. We kissed. And for that single moment, the world was quiet. No questions. No guilt. Just breath and skin and awareness. Then it ended. And neither of us said a word. Back in the car, the silence returned. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't hiding anything. It was just there, like a familiar coat you put back on after the rain. We drove for another hour before stopping for gas again. As he pumped, I checked my phone. One new message. From my husband. Just 2 words. You okay? I stared at it longer than I should have. My thumb hovered over the reply button, but I didn't type anything. Not yet. Instead, I locked the screen, placed the phone in my lap, and looked out the window. The clouds had begun to break, a few soft rays of sunlight slipping through. But inside me, the storm was only beginning. We didn't speak for the next 30 miles. The road ahead was straight and empty, bordered by wide fields and distant barns that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. Every so often, the wind would catch a field of tall grass and send it rippling in waves, and I'd find myself staring into the motion, as if the answer to everything might somehow appear in that sway. But no answers came. Only the same questions, the same pulse of uncertainty beneath my ribs, steady and relentless. The message from my husband stayed unread in my pocket. I couldn't bring myself to answer it, not yet. Not when I didn't even know what the honest response would be. Was I okay? Physically, yes. But everything else inside me was too tangled, too layered to explain in a word or two. I didn't want to lie. But I couldn't tell the truth either. Eventually, we pulled into another small town, this one surrounded by trees and built around a long, slow-moving river. He parked the car near the edge of the water, under the shade of a sycamore tree. Neither of us said a word as we stepped out and walked toward the embankment. There was a bench nearby, worn and weathered, but solid. I sat first. He stayed standing, his arms crossed loosely, his gaze on the water. I could feel the weight of the kiss we shared earlier still hanging in the air. It hadn't been impulsive or theatrical. It had been quiet, almost solemn. But that didn't make it any less real. If anything, it made it heavier. He finally spoke, but his voice was low, cautious. Do you think he knows? I didn't ask who he meant. We both knew. I don't know, I said, eyes still on the slow current. Maybe. Maybe not. There was a pause, filled with the sound of a breeze moving through the leaves above us. "I keep thinking about yesterday," he continued. "The man by the road. The way he looked at us." I nodded. "I haven't stopped thinking about it either." He exhaled, and I could hear the tension in it. "It's not just guilt," he said. "It's the not knowing what comes next." That struck something deep. Because that was exactly where I was, stuck in the murky place between what had already happened and what might still unfold. A place with no rules. No map. I shifted on the bench, resting my hands in my lap. "I've never done anything like this before," I said. He looked at me then, not with judgment or disbelief, but with a kind of softness that made me feel even more exposed. "I know," he said. The sun had started to lower behind the trees, and the light shifted into a golden hue, filtering through the branches. It should have been beautiful, peaceful. But all I could feel was pressure. Inside me, around me. A mounting sense of something coming, though I couldn't name it. We got back into the car after a while and drove into the center of town. It was quaint brick sidewalks, hanging flower baskets, a row of shops with small glass windows and hand-painted signs. He found a place to park and suggested we walk for a bit. I agreed. Movement felt better than sitting still. As we walked, we passed a bookstore, a bakery with the scent of warm bread drifting out onto the street, and a park where children played while parents watched from shaded benches. It was a normal afternoon in a normal place. And somehow, that only made everything feel more surreal. As if we were walking through a version of life that no longer fit us. We stepped into a small cafe with pale blue walls and quiet music playing from a speaker tucked in the corner. The woman behind the counter greeted us with a nod, and we ordered 2 iced teas and a sandwich to share. The inside was cool, a relief from the heat outside. We took a table near the window. I watched the people pass by on the sidewalk, their lives so seemingly uncomplicated. I envied them. Or maybe I envied the version of myself that used to be like them. He sat across from me, watching me carefully, as if waiting for something I wasn't ready to give. And maybe I wasn't. Not yet. The sandwich came, and we ate slowly, sharing it without much conversation. Just a few casual remarks about the town, the weather, the cafe. We kept it safe. But the silence between the words spoke louder than anything else. It pulsed with everything we weren't saying. After we finished, we sat for a few more minutes, neither of us reaching for our phones. Eventually, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, and spoke softly. "I know we can't stay in this in-between space forever." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "We have to go back. To our real lives." "I know," I finally said. And I did. I knew that whatever had unfolded between us during these days couldn't be carried forward. Not without consequences. Not without unraveling everything else. But that didn't make it easier to face. Back at the car, he reached for the door handle and paused. "I'm not sorry," he said, eyes on mine. I hesitated. "I don't think I am either." That night, we stayed in a motel just outside town. A simple place, clean, quiet. Again, 2 beds. Again, a shared silence. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the headlights of passing cars flicker through the trees. Behind me, he sat on the edge of his bed, reading something on his phone. I could feel his presence without turning. Eventually, I lay down fully dressed, arms folded across my stomach, eyes on the ceiling. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room. A soft, persistent sound that matched the tempo of my heartbeat. Somewhere in the stillness, I drifted into sleep. And in that sleep, I dreamed of my husband. We were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. He was speaking, but I couldn't hear the words. His mouth moved, his eyes kind. He reached for my hand. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell him everything. But I couldn't. I woke just before dawn, the light outside barely changing the color of the sky. The room was quiet. He was still asleep. And for the first time in days, I felt something close to peace, sharp, fleeting, but real. Until my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Another message. This time from an unknown number. You looked very close in that cafe. My breath caught. I stared at the screen, heart racing. I didn't move. I didn't respond. I just sat there, staring at those words, knowing the space between what had happened and what would happen next had just collapsed entirely. The phone sat in my hand, its cold weight growing heavier by the second. I stared at the message on the screen, reading it once, then again, and again. The words didn't change. You looked very close in that cafe. No name. No context. Just those 8 words, carefully chosen, deliberately vague and yet unmistakably sharp. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a wrong number. A prank. But deep down, I knew better. The phrasing was too precise. Someone had seen us. Not guessed, seen. And now, they wanted me to know. The room was still dim, the curtains drawn, the sky outside shifting into pale gray. I glanced across the space. He was still asleep, one arm flung over his eyes, the blanket tangled around his legs. Peaceful. Unaware. I didn't want to wake him. Not yet. Not when I didn't even know what I was feeling. I set the phone down slowly, screen facing down, as if hiding it might erase the message from existence. My hands were clammy. My mouth dry. I stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to let in a sliver of morning light. The parking lot was nearly empty, a few cars, a delivery truck, a man walking his dog along the edge of the property. No one suspicious. No eyes watching. But I still felt exposed, like glass. I wanted to breathe deeply, but my chest stayed tight. There was something terrifying about being watched without knowing when or by whom. Someone had crossed the boundary of observation into intention. They wanted me to feel their presence. And I did. I didn't wake him when I stepped into the shower. The water was hot, the pressure weak, but it helped. Not enough to wash away the unease, but enough to anchor me in the moment. I closed my eyes and leaned into the tile, letting the water run down my back, trying to gather my thoughts into something usable. When I came out, he was sitting up, blinking against the light. His hair was a mess, his face still soft from sleep. "You okay?" he asked. I paused by the sink, wiping my face with a towel. "Yeah. Just didn't sleep much." He nodded, not pressing. That was the thing about him, he never demanded answers. But now I wasn't sure if that made things easier or harder. We packed our bags and checked out shortly after. No one at the desk said anything unusual. No looks. No whispers. But I couldn't shake the sensation that something invisible had shifted. That we were being followed, not just physically but by consequences we hadn't yet named. On the road, he drove quietly. I watched the trees blur past, their shapes unchanging. I hadn't told him about the message. I didn't know how. Part of me still hoped it would go away on its own. Another part was already preparing for the next one. We stopped at a gas station an hour later. While he went inside to get coffee, I stayed in the car, reopening the message. There was no follow-up. No typing dots. No contact name. Just the text, sitting there like a weight in my pocket. I considered deleting it. pretending I'd never seen it. But my thumb hesitated over the screen. Deleting it wouldn't undo the reality of it. And if someone was watching, erasing the evidence wouldn't make me invisible. He came back with 2 cups, passed me one through the open window. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound normal. We drove again. Another town, another highway. The silence between us no longer felt like shared understanding, it felt like avoidance. I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye, wondering if he noticed anything different about me. The way I held the cup too tightly. The way my shoulders stayed stiff, even at rest. But if he did, he said nothing. By noon, we reached the outskirts of a larger town, not quite home, but closer. The streets were more familiar. The buildings, more modern. There were people everywhere, walking dogs, pushing strollers, sipping coffee on patios. And yet, I felt completely detached. Like a ghost drifting through a world that didn't belong to me anymore. He parked near a quiet park with a view of the water. We got out and walked without a destination, side by side but not touching. The air was cooler here, the breeze carrying hints of salt and pine. It should have been calming. But inside, I was a tangle of fear, guilt, and something dangerously close to defiance. Eventually, we sat on a bench near the water's edge. Boats drifted slowly in the distance. A child tossed bread to ducks. A man read a newspaper nearby. "I think this is where we stop," I said quietly, not looking at him. He was silent for a moment. "You mean the trip?" "I mean this. Us. Whatever this has been." His breath hitched, almost too softly to hear. "Because of the kiss?" "Because of everything." I didn't mention the message. Not yet. I didn't want it to be the reason, even if it was. I wanted it to be my choice. Or at least to feel like it was. He nodded slowly. "If that's what you want." "It's not what I want. It's what has to happen." The honesty of that sentence surprised me. I hadn't planned to say it that way. But it was true. Wanting wasn't enough. Not when the cost was this high. We sat for a while longer. Saying nothing. Letting the noise of the world fill the space between us. Eventually, we walked back to the car. We didn't touch. We didn't look at each other. We just got in and continued driving. When we reached the edge of my neighborhood, he pulled into a quiet side street and stopped. The car idled, soft and steady. "I'll walk from here," I said. "You sure?" I nodded. "It's better this way." He didn't argue. I got out, closed the door gently, and stood on the sidewalk as he drove away. I waited until the car disappeared around the corner before taking a breath. Then I pulled out my phone. One new message. "I wonder what your husband would think." No name. No reply option. Just those words. I turned off the screen and slid the phone into my pocket. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around my feet. I stood still. Alone. Exposed. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was afraid, or simply ready. The moment I stepped through the front door, the stillness of the house wrapped around me like a heavy coat. Not cold, not warm, just dense, familiar, and strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but expectant. As if the walls knew something I didn't. As if they had been waiting. My suitcase thudded softly against the hallway rug as I set it down. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, almost too loud in the silence. The faint smell of laundry detergent lingered in the air, probably from the load I'd washed just before we left. I hadn't thought much about it then. Now, everything felt more loaded. Even the scent of home had changed. I didn't call out. I wasn't sure who was home, or if anyone was. I didn't want to announce my return, didn't want to be greeted with a smile I wouldn't know how to return. I just stood there for a long moment, keys still clutched in my hand, as if I wasn't sure whether to go deeper or turn around and walk back out. Eventually, I moved. Not quickly, not slowly, just with purpose. I walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, stared at the contents without registering anything. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't anything. Just suspended. On the counter sat a small stack of unopened mail and a note in my husband's handwriting. It read, "Gone to the office. Back late. Hope the trip was smooth." There was nothing accusatory in it. No question, no wait. Just his usual tone. Predictable. Routine. But as I read the note, I felt a strange twist inside me. I had changed. He hadn't. I took the note and folded it neatly, slipping it into my back pocket. Not because it meant anything on its own, but because I couldn't leave it there. I didn't want to see it again. Upstairs, everything was as I'd left it. My side of the bed made, the book I hadn't finished still on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the wall. There was a photo of us on a trip from years ago, before everything felt like a system. Before everything became managed and organized, like a schedule instead of a life. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up, and I already knew what would be waiting. Another message. This one read, "You really thought no one would notice?" Still no name. Still no way to reply. My hands trembled slightly as I locked the screen and set the phone down on the nightstand. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And they weren't going away. But what struck me more deeply than the content of the message was how unsurprised I felt. As if I'd been waiting for the consequences to catch up. As if part of me had always known this moment would come. I didn't tell anyone. Not him. Not my husband. Not even myself, not fully. I just carried it. The next morning, he was back. My husband. He kissed me on the cheek like he always did, asked if the roads were clear, if I'd slept okay, if the documents were dropped off without any trouble. I answered all of it with automatic precision. Yes, clear roads. Yes, slept fine. Yes, everything's handled. He didn't look twice. Didn't ask for more. And that, somehow, hurt the most. I watched him move around the kitchen with ease, pouring coffee, reading the paper, as if nothing had shifted. And maybe for him, it hadn't. Maybe his world was still intact. But mine wasn't. And pretending it was made the cracks grow deeper. That day passed slowly. I folded laundry I didn't remember washing. I watered the plants on the porch. I checked emails and replied to none. I did everything right, everything expected. And none of it helped. By afternoon, I received another message. This time, a photo. Blurry, distant, but unmistakably us. Me and him. Sitting in the cafe, heads tilted toward each other. My expression soft. His eyes focused on me. "This one's my favorite." That was the caption. I sat with the image for a long time, the phone balanced on my knee. I didn't feel panic. I felt inevitability. Whoever it was didn't want anything. No threats. No demands. Just the slow, surgical revelation of knowing. As if they wanted me to implode on my own. Later that evening, my husband mentioned a work trip. 3 days. Out of town. Meetings. Dinners. Late nights. "I'll be back Friday," he said. "You'll have the house to yourself." I nodded. Okay. He smiled at me like everything was fine. Maybe it was both for him. That night, I lay awake longer than I wanted. My thoughts flicked between memory and guilt, between desire and fear. I thought about the park bench. The look in his eyes. The quiet after the kiss. I thought about how easily we had stepped into something we couldn't name, and how impossible it had become to step back out. I reached for my phone again. No new messages. Just the last one, still open on the screen. This one's my favorite. I turned it face down and tried to sleep. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragments. Shuffling paper. Unread emails. A photograph falling from someone's hand. Footsteps behind me that never caught up. The next morning, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the street slowly wake. I could hear children playing somewhere down the block. A dog barking. The distant hum of a garbage truck. And still, I felt like I was waiting. Not for the next message. But for the moment I'd have to choose what came next. The moment the silence between what had happened and what I was willing to admit would crack open, and something would spill through that couldn't be taken back. I didn't know when that would be. But I knew it was coming. The house felt quieter once he left. My husband. 3 days on the road for meetings he'd mentioned in passing, with a tone so casual it might have been about buying milk. I watched from the upstairs window as his car backed out of the driveway and disappeared around the bend. No wave. No glance back. Not that I expected one. We hadn't been the type of couple who waved goodbye in years. I stood there long after the car was gone. The window glass was cool against my fingertips, and the sky was already shifting toward overcast. I could hear the refrigerator humming faintly from downstairs, the occasional groan of the old pipe settling, but otherwise nothing. Just the echo of a house now empty except for me and whatever thoughts I wasn't ready to face. I didn't move quickly. I drifted through the rooms like someone walking through a museum of their own life. Touching nothing. Stopping in doorways. Noticing things I usually ignored, the fading on the carpet near the sofa, the book left open on the side table with a folded corner, the way one of the kitchen chairs had been slightly turned, not pushed in all the way. I should have felt liberated. 3 days alone. Space. Silence. Time to think. But instead, I felt like the walls were closing in. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a slow, creeping kind of quiet that didn't let you breathe too deeply. I checked my phone. No new messages. And somehow, that felt worse. For the past few days, the texts had come like a metronome, keeping pace with my guilt. Whoever they were, they had set a rhythm, and I had started to depend on it, if not for answers, then for the illusion of clarity. But now, nothing. Only the echo of the last message. This one's my favorite. The photo. The implication. The knowledge that someone saw us, not as two people who had made a mistake, but as something watchable. Like entertainment. I couldn't tell if the silence meant it was over, or just beginning. By late morning, I found myself in the backyard. The sky was still cloudy, but the garden needed tending. I pulled on gloves and began pruning the hydrangeas near the fence, not because they were overgrown, but because the motion kept my hands busy. It was mechanical. Precise. And I needed that kind of focus to keep the noise inside my head from getting too loud. While I worked, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A neighbor, walking past on the other side of the fence. We nodded at each other politely. She smiled. I smiled back. Just two women on a weekday morning, pretending everything was normal. She didn't know anything, of course. Not about the trip. Not about the cafe. Not about the kiss. And definitely not about the messages. But for a moment, I wondered what it would feel like if she did. If anyone did. I trimmed a few more branches, then stopped. My phone buzzed on the patio table behind me. One short vibration. I didn't move at first. Just stared at it, the way you stare at something that confirms your worst suspicion. Then I walked slowly, gloves still on, and picked it up. New message. He's gone. You're alone. Now what? I sat down heavily on the nearest chair, the phone still in my hand. The gloves made my grip awkward, and I pulled them off, letting them fall to the ground. The message wasn't threatening. Not directly. But it was personal. It was aware. Someone knew that my husband had left. That I was alone. That I hadn't told anyone. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was observation. I swallowed hard. My first thought wasn't fear, it was shame. Not because of what I had done, but because I had let it follow me home. Because whatever line I'd crossed in that small cafe, in that quiet motel room, had opened something that wouldn't close again. I should have told someone. Him. My husband. Anyone. But I didn't. Instead, I deleted the message. Not out of defiance, but exhaustion. Then I stood up and went back to trimming the bushes. Because sometimes, the only way to deal with being watched is to act like you're not. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the living room with the lights off, just the twilight from outside filtering in. The shadows lengthened across the furniture, soft and slow, until the whole room felt suspended in dusk. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't read. I just sat there, glass in hand, phone face down beside me. I didn't know what I was waiting for. A knock? Another message? Something? Nothing came. I thought about him, my husband's son. About the way he had looked at me during the drive, when neither of us spoke but everything felt louder than words. I thought about his quiet eyes, the way he kept his distance even when we were close. He hadn't sent the messages. I was certain of that. He didn't operate like that. If he had something to say, he would have said it to my face. So then who? And why? Later that night, I lay in bed, fully dressed, the sheets barely pulled back. I hadn't turned on the bedside lamp. I didn't want light. I wanted stillness, even if it made me feel more exposed. Even if it made every creak of the floorboards sound like footsteps, every branch brushing against the window feel like a breath held too long. I checked the phone once more before midnight. Still nothing. No new message. But when I got up to refill my water in the kitchen, I found something else. An envelope. On the doormat. No address. No name. Just a plain white envelope, sealed, waiting. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up. And even longer before I opened it. Inside was a single photo. Printed. From behind the cafe window. Me. Him. Mid-conversation. My hand lightly resting near his. Both of us leaning in, caught in a moment that was never meant to be captured. No caption. No note. Just the photo. I placed it face down on the counter, poured the water, and returned to bed without drinking it. Tomorrow, I would have to decide. Not about what had already happened. But about what I was going to do now. I woke before sunrise, not because I'd set an alarm or because I had anywhere to be, but because something inside me wouldn't let me sleep any longer. My body felt heavy, but my mind was alert, too alert. I lay there in the gray light filtering through the curtains, staring at the ceiling, the silence in the room thick and unmoving. I knew today had to be different. I couldn't keep floating through the hours, waiting for the next vibration on my phone or the next envelope at my door. I couldn't keep reacting. I had to act. The envelope from last night was still where I had left it, on the kitchen counter, beside the untouched glass of water I'd poured and abandoned. The photo inside, face down. I didn't look at it again. I didn't need to. The image was already burned into my memory, etched into my sense of self like a scar. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing clothes that felt simple but composed. Something neutral. Not armor, but something close. I tied my hair back. I didn't put on makeup. I didn't need to perform today. I needed clarity. That was all. By the time the sun was fully up, I had made coffee and stood by the kitchen sink, watching the neighbor across the street water her plants. Her life looked untouched. Clean. Routine. I wondered what she would think if she knew. If she'd recognize the version of me in the photograph. If she'd pity me. Or judge me. Or quietly understand in a way she wouldn't admit. The house remained still. I walked through it again, this time not drifting. I moved with purpose. I collected the towels from the bathroom, folded the blankets on the couch, wiped down the counters. I wasn't trying to erase anything. I just needed to make order out of the chaos, even if that order was only surface deep. I paused at the door to my husband's office. It was closed. Always closed when he was away. I didn't go in. Not because I feared what was behind it, but because I knew that some boundaries, even now, weren't worth crossing. I had crossed enough already. Around noon, I walked to the small cafe down the street. The one I used to go to once a week, back when routines meant something different. I brought a notebook and pen, though I didn't write anything. I just sat by the window, letting the ambient noise of clinking mugs and soft conversations surround me. I didn't look at my phone. I didn't check for new messages. For the first time in days, I wasn't waiting for something to come to me. I was simply being. But even then, I couldn't fully escape it, the undercurrent of awareness, the subtle tension in my shoulders, the instinct to glance at the door every time it opened. I stayed for an hour. Maybe less. Long enough to feel the edges soften slightly. Then I left. When I returned home, the sun was already dipping toward late afternoon. I made myself something to eat, though I didn't finish it. I was restless again. The stillness no longer soothed me. It pressed in. It wasn't until I stood at the sink again, washing the half-empty dish, that I saw him. Not in the yard. Not at the door. But in my memory. Sitting across from me in that garden cafe. His face calm, attentive. The way he'd watched me speak without interruption, without judgment. The way he'd made space for me to exist, not as a wife, not as a step anything, not as someone defined by responsibility or routine, but just as a person. As a woman who had forgotten how to be seen. I missed that. And I hated that I missed it. And yet, I didn't regret the moments we had shared. I regretted the secrecy. The weight of it. The hiding. The shame that had filled the spaces where honesty should have lived. As the sky turned orange, I took the envelope again from the counter. I placed it in a drawer, closed it, and walked away. It was no longer a threat. Just a relic. A record of something I could no longer change. My husband came home late that night. I heard the key in the door, the thump of his shoes against the mat. I met him in the hallway. He looked tired. He set his bag down, rubbed the back of his neck. Long day? I asked. He nodded. Very. I moved aside to let him pass. He went straight to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, leaned against the counter. How was the house? He asked. Quiet, I said. He nodded. Didn't press. Later, we sat in the living room together. Not speaking. The television played softly in the background, something neither of us was really watching. He scrolled on his phone. I watched the shadows on the wall shift as the evening passed. We were in the same room, but not in the same place. When he finally went upstairs, I stayed behind. I needed the solitude. I turned the television off, let the silence settle again. Then I picked up my phone. Opened my photos. Scrolled past old images, vacations, dinners, the occasional sunset. I found the one that mattered. The one someone else had taken from outside the cafe. I stared at it for a long time. I saved it to a private folder. Not because I wanted to revisit it, but because I didn't want it to be used against me. Then I deleted the message. And then another. All of them. Each one disappearing into digital ash, leaving nothing behind but the choices I still had to make. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about refusing to be haunted by it. That night, I lay in bed next to a man who didn't know the full story. And I didn't tell him. Not yet. But I would. Not because someone might expose me. But because I couldn't keep living in the space between truth and silence. And when I did tell him, whenever that would be, I would do it on my own terms. No message. No envelope. No one else's timeline but mine. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, sleep came without hesitation. Not peaceful, but honest. And that was enough.